Chapter 7, Lesson 2. The War Expands. Main idea. Some Europeans decided to help America. As the war continued, it spread to the sea and the frontier. One American story. To defeat the British Empire, the United States needed a foreign ally. An ally is a country that agrees to help another country achieve a common goal. The ideal ally would share America's goal of defeating Britain. So the United States turned to France, Britain's longtime enemy. In 1776, Congress sent Benjamin Franklin to France to persuade it to be the ally of the United States. Famous for his experiments with electricity, Franklin became a celebrity in Paris. He wrote to his daughter, saying that medallions with his likeness were popular there. A voice from the past. These, with the pictures, busts, and prints, have made your father's face as well known as that of the moon. From Benjamin Franklin. Letter to his daughter Sally. After America's victory at Saratoga, the French agreed to an alliance. This section explains how the war expanded with foreign aid. Help from abroad. France was still bitter over its defeat by Britain in the French and Indian War, in which France lost its North American colonies. The French hoped to take revenge on the British by helping Britain's American colonies break free. In 1776, France began to give secret aid to the Americans. However, the French didn't want to lose to Britain a second time. That is why they didn't publicly ally themselves with the United States until after the Americans had proved they could win battles. After hearing of the American victory at Saratoga, King Louis XVI of France recognized U.S. independence. In 1778, France signed 2 treaties of alliance with the United States. By doing so, France went to war with Britain. As part of its new alliance, France sent badly needed funds, supplies, and troops to America. In 1779, France persuaded its ally Spain to help the Americans. Spain was also Britain's rival. The Spanish governor of Louisiana, General Bernardo de Galvez, acted quickly. He captured the British strongholds of Natchez and Baton Rouge in the lower Mississippi Valley. From there, his small army went on to take Mobile and in 1781 Pensacola in West Florida. These victories prevented the British from attacking the United States from the southwest. In addition, Britain had to keep thousands of troops fighting Galvez instead of fighting the Americans. However, like France, Spain's motives were not simply to help the United States. Galvez's victories helped extend Spain's empire in North America. By entering the war on America's side, France and Spain forced the British to fight a number of enemies on land and sea. The British had to spread their military resources over many fronts. For example, they were so afraid they might have to fight the French in the West Indies, so they sent their troops there. This prevented the British from concentrating their strength to defeat the inexperienced Americans. Europeans help Washington. The Americans gained some of the military experience they needed from Europe. Several European military officers came to Washington's aid, including men from France, Poland, and the German states. The Marquis de Lafayette was a 19-year-old French nobleman who volunteered to serve in Washington's army. He wanted a military career, and he believed in the American cause. He quickly gained Washington's confidence and was given the command of an army division. Lafayette won respect and love from his men by sharing their hardships. Called the soldier's friend, he used his own money to buy warm clothing for his ragged troops. Washington regarded him almost as a son. Lafayette fought in many battles and also persuaded the French king to send a 6,000-man army to America. He became a hero in both France and the United States. Later, he took part in France's own revolution. Along with Lafayette came the Baron de Kalb, a German officer who had served in the French army. He became one of Washington's generals and earned a reputation for bravery. In 1780, he received 11 wounds at the Battle of Camden and died. Another German, Baron von Steuben, helped turn the inexperienced Americans into a skilled fighting force. Washington asked him to train the army. In 1778, Steuben began forming a model company of 100 men. Then he taught them how to move in lines and columns and how to handle weapons properly. Under Steuben's direction, the soldiers practiced making charges with bayonets, a long steel knife attached to the ends of guns. Within a month, the troops were executing drills with speed and precision. Once the model company succeeded, the rest of the army adopted Steuben's methods. Winter at Valley Forge. Help from Europeans came at a time when the Americans desperately needed it. In late 1777, Britain's General Howe forced Washington to retreat from Philadelphia. Beginning in the winter of 1777 to 1778, Washington and his army camped at Valley Forge in southeast Pennsylvania. On the march to Valley Forge, Washington's army was so short on supplies that many soldiers had only blankets to cover themselves. They also lacked shoes. The barefoot men left tracks of blood on the frozen ground as they marched. The soldiers' condition did not improve at camp. The Marquis de Lafayette described what he saw. A voice from the past. The unfortunate soldiers were in want of everything. They had neither coats, nor hats, nor shirts, nor shoes. Their feet and their legs froze till they grew black, and it was often necessary to amputate them. The army frequently passed whole days without food. From Marquis de Lafayette, quoted in Valley Forge, Pinnacle of Courage. Because of this, the name Valley Forge came to stand for the great hardships that Americans endured in the Revolutionary War. Over the winter, the soldiers at Valley Forge grew weak from not having enough food or warm clothing. Roughly a quarter of them died from malnutrition, exposure to the cold, or diseases such as smallpox and typhoid fever. Washington appealed to Congress to send the soldiers supplies, but it was slow in responding. Luckily, private citizens sometimes came to the soldiers' aid. According to one story, on New Year's Day, 1778, a group of Philadelphia women drove 10 teams of oxen into camp. The oxen were pulling wagons loaded with supplies and 2,000 shirts. The women had the oxen killed to provide food for the men. Despite the hardships, Washington and his soldiers showed amazing endurance. Under such circumstances, soldiers often desert or leave military duty without intending to return. Some soldiers did desert, but Lieutenant Colonel John Brooks wrote that the army stayed together because of love of our country. The men also stayed because of Washington. Private Samuel Downing declared that the soldiers loved him. They sell their lives for him. War on the frontier. Elsewhere, other Americans took on difficult challenges. In 1777, a 24-year-old frontiersman named George Rogers Clark walked into the office of Virginia's Governor Patrick Henry. Clark said he had come to take part in defending the western frontier. He lived in Kentucky, which was claimed by Virginia. Clark wanted Virginia to defend the region against British soldiers and their Native American allies in what is now Indiana and Illinois. If a country is not worth protecting, he said, it is not worth claiming. Clark was difficult to ignore. He stood 6 feet tall, had red hair, and displayed a dramatic personality. He persuaded Governor Henry that he was right. The governor told Clark to raise an army to capture British posts on the western frontier. In May of 1778, Clark and a group of frontiersmen began to travel down the Ohio River. He recruited others on the way, until he had a force of 175 to 200. They went by boat and later on foot to Kaskaskia, a British post on the Mississippi River. They captured Kaskaskia without a fight. Then they moved east to take Fort Saxville at Vincennes, in present-day Indiana. Earlier, a small force sent by Clark had taken Vincennes, but British forces under Henry Hamilton had recaptured it. Settlers called Hamilton the hair buyer because he supposedly paid rewards for American scalps. Determined to retake Fort Saxville, Clark and his men set out for Vincennes from Kaskaskia in February 1779. Hamilton wasn't expecting an attack because the rivers were overflowing their banks and the woods were flooded. Clark's men slogged through miles of icy swamps and waded through chest-deep water. They caught the British at Vincennes by surprise. When Hamilton and his troops tried to remain in the fort, Clark pretended to have a larger force than he really had. He also found a way to frighten the British into leaving. Clark and his men had captured several Native Americans who were allies of the British and had American scalps on their belts. Clark executed some of them in plain view of the fort. He promised to do the same to Hamilton and his men if they didn't surrender immediately. The British gave up. Clark's victory gave Americans a hold on the vast region between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River. This area is more than half the total size of the original 13 states. However, Fort Detroit on Lake Erie remained in the hands of the British. War at sea. The war expanded not only to the frontier, but also to the sea. By 1777, Britain had about 100 warships off the American coast. This allowed British to control the Atlantic trade routes. There was no way the Americans could defeat the powerful British army. But American privateers attacked British merchant ships. A privateer is a privately owned ship that a wartime government gives permission to attack an enemy merchant's ships. After capturing a British merchant ship, the crew of a privateer sold its cargo and shared the money. As a result, a desire for profit as well as patriotism motivated privateers. The states and Congress commissioned more than 1,000 privateers to prey on the British. During the war, they captured hundreds of British ships. This disrupted trade, causing the British merchants to call for the end to war. Many men answered the privateers' calls for volunteers. Among them was 14-year-old James Forten, who was the son of a free African-American sailmaker. In 1780, Forten signed up to sail on the Royal Louis to earn money for his family after his father died. When a British ship captured the Royal Louis in 1781, the British offered Forten a free trip to England. Reportedly, Forten refused, saying that he would never betray his country. Released from a British prison after the war, Forten walked barefoot from New York to his home in Philadelphia. He later became famous for his efforts to end slavery. A naval hero. Though outnumbered, the Continental Navy scored several victories against the British. An officer named John Paul Jones won the most famous sea battle. In 1779, Jones became the commander of a ship named Bohème Richard. With 4 other ships, he patrolled the English coast. In September, Jones's vessels approached a convoy in which 2 British warships were guarding a number of supply ships. Jones closed in on the Serapis, the larger of the 2 warships. At one point, the Bohème Richard rammed the better-armed British vessel. As the 2 ships locked together, the confident British captain demanded that Jones surrender. In words that have become a famous U.S. Navy slogan, Jones replied, "I have not yet begun to fight." The 2 warships were so close together that the muzzles of their guns almost touched. They blasted away, each seriously damaging the other. On the shore, crowds of Britons gathered under a full moon to watch the fighting. After a fierce 3.5-hour battle, the main mast of the Serapis cracked and fell. The ship's captain then surrendered. The Bohème Richard was so full of holes that it eventually sank, so Jones and his crew had to sail away in the Serapis. Jones's success against the best navy in the world angered the British and inspired the Americans. Even so, the Americans knew that the war had to be won on land. The next section discusses the major land battles in the closing years of the war.